But we also have to recognise we don't have the same consensual tradition, political tradition, parliamentary tradition that other European countries have had and other European countries have been able to draw upon. So I understand that from the other member states' point of view, this can look very adversarial, and we are having to do something that we don't have traditions of doing in this House. And I hope that the attempts to do so now will be effective and will lead to a conclusion. And I hope certainly the cross-party working that we have managed to achieve to get this bill in place and to get this motion to go forward is an indicator that it is possible for us to draw on more consensual traditions when it comes to this kind of constitutional change.
We should give way.
But to be honest, I ought to finish because I think other members want to talk. But I think I conclude simply where I started, which is that we do need, in the end, on for something that is constitutional change, we do need people to try to come together and to reach agreement. We are all of us aware, no matter what our votes have been over the last few months and certainly few weeks, all of us have had the kind of threats or abuse to our constituency offices and so on, and that is damaging to our democracy and damaging to our debates. So I hope that we will be able to come together and find a way forward and support the Prime Minister's motion today.
Order. There are 25 minutes to go and 5 people wanting to speak. 5-minute limit. Anne Main.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's very nice to have followed the Honourable Lady for Normanton and Pontefract and Castleford, because she talked about consensual approach to this. Well, the consensual approach to this House was to trigger Article 50, and the consensual approach from this House was to have the date until the 29th of March. Now, the extension that is potentially being requested today is a very open-ended extension, and I want to say why I find this incredibly concerning. The rhetoric that's been surrounding this particular extension has been coming across the media that potentially, and indeed the Attorney General said today, that we may not have to take up our seats if we end up taking part in the European elections. But potentially, if we take a year or longer, those European parliamentarians may well be in their seats. And I find it somewhat bizarre that we are talking about good behaviour, not interrupting a budget. In other words, trying to bind in any way, shape or form those people who may have stood on manifestos of their own making, or potentially a Conservative manifesto, and then are somehow expected to behave themselves and be good. That I find very, very worrying. And indeed, if that is the discussions that are taking place, how much more so is it worrying that somehow there might be extracted from the Prime Minister of this country a similar agreement that she should also behave herself, that any form of the British government should behave themselves and not give due scrutiny or any form of criticism towards the budget, which I think is very worrying. Of course I'll give way to the right.
Thank the Honourable Lady, and I'm following her very, very carefully. Would she also agree with me that it does seem really humiliating for this country to have our Prime Minister going over to the European Union to literally beg for an extension? I mean, what is this saying about our country when we know that 17.5 million people very simply said they wanted to leave? Very simple.
I completely agree with the Honourable Lady, and I'd like to just refresh the House's memory for those in the House that may think that there is no problem whatsoever in having this full extension. On 2002, the Council decision was that members of the European Parliament shall vote on an individual and personal basis. They shall not be bound by any instructions and shall not receive a binding mandate. This article also referred to the fact that members shall exercise their mandate freely and independently and shall not be bound by any instructions and shall not receive a binding mandate. And this actually, as I said, is extremely worrying, that there is this loose talk about what we may or may not expect of MEPs if they stand in the next elections. We have to take this seriously, that MEPs that stand in the next elections have every right to take up their seat. The likelihood is this House will not reach any form of agreeable consensus. It needs restating that only 5 members of the opposition party agreed to trigger the separated withdrawal agreement, and yet the political declaration was always open for open discussion, and there seems to be wanting to bind any future leader of this party. This is not democracy when people are seeking to bind the hands and bind the voices and bind the opinions of duly elected members of the who are MEPs, speaking on behalf of their constituents, or indeed particularly this government. I think it's absolutely appalling that we may be seeking an extension with no real sense of purpose. If the extension had an undertaking from the party opposite, for example, that of course they supported the withdrawal agreement and it was simply the political declaration, then maybe our Prime Minister could go along in the sure and certain knowledge that some sort of deal could be done fairly quickly. The party opposite, I will give way briefly.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Not only will there be no sense of purpose, but there's no certainty either. What her constituents and my constituents and business is crying out for is certainty. But there'll be members on the benches opposite who are voting for this, secretly hoping that it won't end on the 30th of June, but there'll be further extensions, and does that not cause further uncertainty?
Well, an honourable colleague on the backbenches who has admirably said about this being kicked around a cul-de-sac as well as being down into the cul-de-sac. But the point I want to make is that we are not having any sense of purpose from the party opposite. Without even wanting to get past first base of the withdrawal agreement, which would be absolutely necessary in whatever political declaration they wish to try and bind our government's hands with, that actually our Prime Minister cannot go and seek any future date with any knowledge that she can give any forms of assurances to the European Union. Now, I would rather she didn't seek an extension, because I think we're becoming a laughing stock that we cannot stick by our words, by our manifestos, by our undertakings that have been given in this House by votes that we have made to trigger Article 50. I think we're becoming a laughing stock, and I don't know why anyone would turn out for any future referendum or even elections when they cannot believe a word that goes on in here. So all I can say is without being able to get past first base, the party opposite need to look at themselves. If there's a flexension, they need to say what the flexension's for, because the withdrawal agreement would certainly be part of it. So there is a real unhappiness, I think, with the public out there, that people say we need to be consensual. 5 members opposite reached across to be consensual with the Prime Minister. That says a lot. I changed my position and voted for the withdrawal agreement. Why? Not because it's perfect, but because I can see where this is going in this House. This House is doing its level best to bind the hands of the Prime Minister, to particularly bind the hands of any MEPs should they be elected and try and get them to play nice, to try and remove any scrutiny that this is the right of our taxpayers in this country to ensure scrutiny of the EU budget. It's not to go and play nice because we happen to be leaving the club at some unspecified point. So can I say I'm against this extension today? I am against it because I'm not even sure what conditions are going to be extracted for it. I'm not sure that the party opposite will ever be prepared to withdraw anything because they couldn't even agree the withdrawal agreement. And so therefore, the whole point of this extension is, from all I can see, is to make sure that we are bound in our agreements with the EU and stymied by staying in, and having this kicked so far down the road that the argument then becomes, well, probably half those people were dead that voted in that referendum. We need to bring it all back again. This is no way to treat the British public. And for those that say they want certainty, there is no certainty in a flexension. There is no certainty in an open-ended, let's keep chatting about it agreement. This is the worst of all worlds, Mr. Speaker. And I sincerely hope that all those members that couldn't even bring themselves to support the withdrawal agreement, forgetting all the other things they weren't happy about because they didn't trust the Prime Minister, need to ask themselves, how consensual is that? I mean, I know the honourable member who spoke before me for Normanton is busy on her phone at the moment, but consensual works both ways. 5 members opposite, none at the TIG. This is how consensual the opposite side of this House is. It is holding our Prime Minister and our country and this Brexit to ransom, and it's time they worked up the fact that they are going to rue the day they are doing this.
Hilary Benn.
Very much indeed. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by acknowledging that the Prime Minister, for the second time now, has decided to put the national interest before taking this country over the cliff of a no-deal Brexit. And I would say to members opposite who've argued for no deal, the Leave campaign at no point suggested that what they were proposing to the British people was that we should leave without a deal. I also want to pay tribute to my right honourable friend sitting next to me for her role and that of others, including the right honourable member for West Dorset, that have encouraged the Prime Minister to act in the national interest because of this bill. Now, I will vote for the motion. The government is seeking an extension to the 30th of June, but we won't know until the end of tomorrow whether that date is granted or a different date. But it seems to me there are two truths here. The first is that whatever date is offered to her, I think the Prime Minister is going to have to take it. And the second is that we will, having been granted it, and I hope we are, have to decide what on earth we're going to do with the additional time. Now, I welcome the fact that the government has reached out to the opposition and that the talks are taking place, but I would just gently say they are going to require some flexibility, a willingness to move, some compromise on the part of the government if we're going to make progress. And for me, I think that should include compromise on how we will finally take the decision. Because the House has been very clear. Why are we in this state today? The House has been very clear. It will not accept leaving without an agreement. And we're also here because it's become clear that the promise that we could somehow, on the one hand, retain all of our sovereignty, bring it all back, and on the other hand, keep all of the economic benefits of European Union membership was not true. And the Prime Minister's deal really lays that bare. And that is why some members opposite cannot bring themselves to vote for the Prime Minister's deal, because I would argue it confronts them with a choice that they are not prepared to make. And the irony of this, we've had the criticism from opposite, but if all the people on those benches who campaigned most passionately for leaving the European Union had voted for the deal, we'd be out by now. But, Mr. Speaker, it is not a choice which the nation can continue to avoid. We must confront it. And I think the Attorney General spoke very wisely, I think, to Nick Robinson the other day when he said, we have underestimated its complexity. He was referring to Brexit. We are unpicking 45 years of in-depth integration. This needed to be done with very great care. It needs a hard-headed understanding of realities. And that's why I would argue that the situation today is different from that in June 2016. I will give way once, yes.
Would he agree with me that part of the shame of this process is that it has proved possible that the government could ever have underestimated the impossibility of unpicking 46 years of close cooperation?
The right honourable gentleman points to one of the other truths about this process, which sadly some people were unwilling to acknowledge in the course of campaigning for leaving, and the fact that they never had a plan has been exposed for all to see. And I have learnt over 2.5 years just how much the complexity of those relationships means to businesses and companies and individuals in their lives of the length and breadth of the land. Look, I think people knew why they voted in the way that they did. No one is saying they didn't. But what they were offered did not and does not exist. And therefore, is it not time for us to put that truth back to the British people, especially as the more time that passes, the more the mandate from the referendum of June 2016 will inevitably age. Now, I don't know, Mr. Speaker, whether the British people have or have not changed their minds, but I have come to the conclusion that we should now ask them whether they wish to confirm their original decision or not in the light of the real choice that confronts the country and not the fantasy that was offered 3 years ago. And if we agreed to do that, then we could move on, because however long the extension that is granted, and we must hope and pray in the national interest that we do get one tomorrow, then the drama, and it is a continuing drama, the anger, and I acknowledge the anger that has been referred to by members opposite. The member for North Shropshire spoke about that with real passion. And the uncertainty could finally be brought to a conclusion in the hands, the capable hands, of the British people.
It would help if people would confine themselves to 3 minutes each. Anna Soubry.
Speaker. And it's a great pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman as ever, and I agree with everything that he says. Mr. Speaker, I have to say that every time I hear an honourable or right honourable member from the benches opposite standing up and making the case for a no-deal, off-the-cliff, hardest of all Brexits, I have to say that I grow stronger in my belief that I did the right thing by leaving that party. Because for people who claim to be the party of business, to do the one thing that British business does not want, that would be ruinous, in the words of the business secretary, it fills me with absolute astonishment, and I have to say that that is the future of the Conservative Party, that the direction of travel is towards that far right, that extreme version of Brexit, and it's not acceptable. I'll quickly give way, but only for the minute.
I thank you for giving way. Could I just place on record that not everybody on this side shares that view, and I think she knows from conversations that we've had that I do not share that view, and my constituents do not share that view.
I don't for one moment doubt that the honourable gentleman doesn't share that view, but the reality is that a majority of the members of the Conservative Party, as we have heard in earlier speeches, are absolutely travelling in that direction. And the next leader of the Conservative Party will be exactly the sort of person who does believe in the most ruinous version of Brexit, which is that no-deal Brexit. But, Mr. Speaker, I was heartened today around lunchtime when I attended a rally here in central London organised by the People's Vote. And what a rally it was, comprising of people from all backgrounds, of all ages, from all over the United Kingdom, who'd come together in support of that this matter now goes back to the British people. And the star of the rally was undoubtedly the most brilliant Baroness Boothroyd, who got a standing ovation before she even spoke. And after she spoke, got another rousing standing ovation, and rightly so. And as she reminded everybody in the audience that she is in her 90th year, I don't think she really wanted that broadcast, but the point that she made so beautifully and so compassionately, as well as passionately, is that this whole issue is not about her generation. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it's not about my generation at the age of 62 either. It's actually about our children and our grandchildren. And the overwhelming message that came away from that rally was that so many young people have spoken to their parents and their grandparents, and increasingly in turn, they are saying, yes, we voted leave, but now we have listened to our children and our grandchildren as we've seen the reality of Brexit unfold. We have taken the view that we have changed our minds, and it is profoundly ironic that there are honourable and right honourable members opposite who have changed their minds, who have changed their votes and voted for the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement, but they deny the people of this country the same opportunity 2.5 years on to have the right for a final say and indeed to change their minds as well. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's finally worth remembering this. When people talk about the will of the people, the evidence is clear, the will of the people is changing. In any event, 63% of people in this country didn't vote to leave the European Union. Of the 52% that did vote, they did not vote for this Brexit chaos, this Brexit crisis. And as they see Brexit unfold, increasingly they are demanding that final say. They're demanding that people's vote. I will vote for this motion, but I want a longer extension so we can have that confirmatory vote, we can have the people's vote, because it's the only way out of this crisis.
Speaker, I'd like to start very briefly by thanking the members for Pontefract, Leeds Central, Beaconsfield, West Dorset and indeed for Cardiff South for getting us as far as we have got today. Just on the subject of the extension, I certainly wouldn't want our friends in the European Union to think that the 30th of June is by any stretch of the imagination ideal or leaves us satiated, because it doesn't. It's clearly not long enough for a people's vote, albeit clearly is long enough for the European elections to take place, and certainly we as a party and a number of other parties here today will be fighting those very hard and very positively, but it's not long enough for a people's vote.
Would you give way?
Very happy to give way.
Would he agree that the June date is not long enough for not only the people's vote, but also for some kind of process like citizens' assemblies that might just have a chance of bringing the country back together again by addressing some of the very real reasons that people voted leave in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely, and clearly an extension could be used for that purpose, or indeed for expanding on the process that is already taking place with all of the parties in this place, with the exception, I'm afraid, of the DUP, actually working cross-party to try and find a way forward. So it could be part of that process. So the extension isn't long enough for a people's vote, which would require probably 20 weeks or thereabouts to be planned and for a campaign to take place. So really, we need an extension till September at the very least. So I would like to help the Prime Minister. She should accept the flextension, which we hope will be offered to her tomorrow, because that will save her from embarrassment in the future. Members will recall that she said there wasn't going to be a general election and then there was, that she was going to stand by the withdrawal agreement that she had spent months negotiating with the European Union, which she then didn't stand by. She said there wasn't going to be an extension to Article 50 and then there was, so she could save herself a lot of embarrassment by simply accepting that there is going to be a people's vote and therefore a long extension is required to deliver one. Now, we are assuming, of course, that, and I think it's a safe assumption, that we will get granted an extension by the European Union. But, of course, if we don't, I think we do need some clarity from ministers in terms of exactly what is going to happen, what the next steps that the Minister for Worcester, who is now in his place, referred to, actually include. So will those next steps include, if we do not get an extension to Article 50, simply to revoke Article 50 by the end of this week? And if the Minister wants to intervene to confirm that that is the case, he's very welcome to do so. He's got a frown on his face, but I think he's reflecting intensely on it. But, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to conclude by saying again that the Prime Minister must face up to the truth. She will need a long extension. She should grasp it tomorrow to avoid humiliation a few weeks later when she has to go to ask for it.
Order. I also want the honourable gentleman for Erdington to get in. Grant Davis, very briefly.
Mr. Speaker, people who voted Leave in Swansea voted for good things. They voted for more money, more control, more trade, control over immigration, and now they find and they say they're not going to get any of these things. They have to pay more money. There won't be more trade. We'll have an open border in Northern Ireland. And so they're saying to me they've been let down and they want to vote on the deal in front of them as to whether it stacks up to what they promised. And it won't. I very much hope that we'll get a long extension so there can be a proper collaboration between the parties to put a deal, a Labour-Tory mixed deal, to the country so people can decide whether they're better off in or out of the EU. And I very much think everyone who talks to me in Swansea is saying, look, this is taking longer, it's costing more, it's much more complicated than we were told before. The French are now saying that in the event that we don't agree a deal, in the event that we don't have a long extension, our default position we have chosen is no deal. But frankly, the people who voted Leave, they don't even like what they're seeing, let alone no deal, which would be a complete calamity. And given this House has now voted on a number of occasions to say no to no deal, it's important that the default position, that the default position isn't no deal, but is revocation. I put down a bill to this extent. It's very important that we remember we should stay where we are. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I had the great privilege of opening an exhibition to Henry Richard, who people will remember was the Apostle of Peace, who was an MP in this place until 1888, and he actually put forward arbitration in the Treaty of Paris that ended the Crimean War. He was very much of the thought that the canvas for future peace and prosperity should be across Europe. Obviously, we saw the bloodshed of the First and the Second World War, but now we're seeing a situation where Europe is in jeopardy of breaking apart. At last, people are beginning to think we've made a mistake, and a lot of older people are saying to me now, I voted to leave, but I've got concern, I've got guilt, and I want to make things better. I want to vote on whether we in fact do remain in the EU, and so I very much hope we'll have a flextension, we'll have an opportunity to talk again about a possible deal, put that to the people, and in my mind we should stay where we are with the best deal in the EU.
Secretary May.
Mr. Speaker, the Jaguar plant lies at the heart of Erdington. Rich in talent but one of the poorest constituencies in the country. Turned around from closure in 2010, it doubled in size to 3,300. Transformed the lives of thousands of workers locally. It's now lost 1,000 jobs, and it would be unthinkable to put it at risk. The voice of the world of work could not be clearer. The CBI and the TUC, we're facing a national emergency. No to no deal. The SMMT building cars, ADS building planes.
Make UK, the old Engineering Employers Federation, all saying a no-deal Brexit will be a catastrophe. The Food and Drink Federation, prices would soar, no deal would be a disaster. Our farmers, we would face immense problems with our biggest market on the continent. No deal would be a disaster. The Investment Association, talking about the billions of money now flooding out of the country rather than being invested here in our economy. The Ceramics Confederation, warning that household names will close at the next stages, the quintessentially English product of the potteries. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are those who believe that they know more about building cars than those who build cars, more about building planes than those who build planes, more about national security than the head of national security, who has warned against the catastrophe of a no-deal Brexit. They are wrong. And for those who talk about a managed no deal is like a managed parachute jump without a parachute. Were we to plunge over the cliff into a no-deal Brexit, our country would be the poorer in every sense of the word for a generation. The task now is for us to come together in Parliament to find a way forward, a better deal for Britain. And in conclusion, I'd like to pay tribute to Tory colleagues with whom we've worked, the Honourable Member for West Dorset, the Honourable Member for Meriden. I'd like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Pontefract, Normanton and Castleford for the outstanding leadership that she's shown, all working together to prevent a no-deal Brexit. Why? Because it would be a catastrophe our country would take a generation to recover from. We cannot go over the cliff.
Order. Under the standing order, I must now put the question. The question is motion number 6, as on the order paper. As many as other opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Division! Clear the lobby. The question is motion number 6, as on the order paper. As many as other opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Alistair Jack and Jeremy Quinn. Tellers for the noes, Dame Cheryl Gillan and Mr. Simon Clark. Order! Order!
The ayes to the right, 420. The noes to the left, 110.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 420. The noes to the left, 110. So the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Order. We now come to the general debate on housing. To move the motion, I call the Minister. Minister Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, as we forge a new relationship with the European Union, building the homes our country needs is a mission more important than ever, because a home is so much more than a roof over your head. It speaks directly to your home.